Good morning, everyone. We'll get started in just a moment. I'll let people join. Good morning, Gary and everyone else. Glad the chat's working. Hope everybody's staying warm. All right, we can go ahead and get started. Welcome to the Kentucky Harm Reduction and Recovery Community of Practice webinar series presented by Voices of Hope and the University of Kentucky Harm Reduction Hub. My name is Brooke West. I am a person in recovery and the training and education manager at Voices of Hope in Lexington, Kentucky. The goal of a community of practice is to bring together a group to engage in training, share best practices, and network around a common interest. Today, the topic of our community of practice is recovery capital and women, how transactional sex and/or sex work can impact recovery, presented by Dr. Hartley Feld and Casey Bitchek. But before their presentation, we're going to hear from Casey, Community Research Associate, who is providing an update from the University of Kentucky Harm Reduction Hub. Casey is doing double duty today on the webinar. So a couple of housekeeping notes. One is if you are a peer support specialist interested in continuing education for this webinar, you will need to complete the survey that we will place in the chat toward the end of the session. And as most of you have discovered, we have the chat feature on so you can participate during the webinar, and we encourage you to participate and to ask questions. This is where it could get a little confusing, so please listen carefully because we actually have two surveys happening today. Casey and Hartley are also collecting data to evaluate this presentation about sex work and recovery, and they want to learn more about any concerns or issues that you may see as it relates to recovery capital. So if you're able to stay for the entire webinar, we will have a QR code with a link at the end of the presentation to a survey that should take about 15 minutes to complete. And for your participation and feedback, you will be mailed a $25 Visa gift card. So they'll explain more about that later, but just know there's two surveys that there will be a QR code at the end of the presentation, but also we'll put that link in the chat as well. So we'll have a link for the continuing education certificate and a link for the survey for Hartley and Casey's presentation to get the $25 Visa gift card. But before all that, I'm going to introduce Casey Bitchek, a harm reductionist with over a decade of experience working in syringe service programs, advocacy organizations, and community-driven research studies. Casey has held direct service roles at syringe service programs in New York, New York, and Louisville, Kentucky, and has provided training and technical assistance on working with people who use drugs and/or trade sex to harm reduction programs and health departments across the country. Casey came to harm reduction work through lived experience of substance use and a desire to keep herself and her community as safe as possible. As Community Research Associate at the Harm Reduction Hub, Casey will provide monthly updates on the Hub's syringe residue testing project on this webinar, as well as harm reduction education about emerging adulterants in the drug supply. So welcome, Casey. I'll turn it over to you for the Harm Reduction Hub update.
Thanks, Brooke. Hi, everyone. Good morning. I hope you're not sick of me by 11:30. But we'll jump into the Harm Reduction Hub update. So, hi, I'm Casey Bitchek, Community Research Associate at the Harm Reduction Hub. Here's a quick agenda for today. I'm going to give you, just for anyone who happens to be unfamiliar, an overview of the UK Harm Reduction Hub and what we are or what we do. And then I will give you our final October syringe testing results. I know that for those of you who joined our November webinar, or the November webinar, that you heard the October testing results. Those were preliminary results. We've been working on fine-tuning how we get results when we finalize our results. And so from this webinar forward, the results will be 2 months back. So you'll hear the final October results today, and then in January, you'll hear the final November results and so forth. So sorry for the confusion, and hopefully it's still, I know it'll still be valuable to y'all to hear. And then I'm going to talk about a notable contaminant that we're seeing, lidocaine. And then I'll talk about overamping, which is overdosing on stimulants, and how to respond to that. So, all right. So, first of all, the UK Harm Reduction Hub. For those who are unfamiliar, we are an initiative that brings together scientists, community-based scientists, academics, researchers, and harm reductionists. And our goal is to provide early insights into Kentucky's street drug supply, which we do by analyzing residue in used syringes. Though we're based at the University of Kentucky, we are a service first and foremost. And two-way feedback loops are so critical to our success. We want to hear from the community we're serving. We have a steering committee made up of people who work in the community, including people with lived experience, so that we want the goal of that steering committee is to govern our work and guide our work and make sure that it is relevant to the community and that the community of people who use drugs and people who serve people who use drugs in Kentucky are getting the most that they possibly can be out of our service. So yeah, that's the Harm Reduction Hub. And I'll get right into the final October testing results. So in October of 2025, we found substances in, and sorry, my cat will likely be on my lap this whole time. Um, we we found substances in 600 syringes from Jefferson, Fayette, and Perry counties. This month, we saw significant increases in cocaine. It was present in about 18% of the syringes that had any substances in them. And about 60% of those syringes, 62 of them, were from partner sites in Fayette County. So we're seeing a lot more cocaine coming out of Fayette County than Jefferson or Perry County, or in the syringes in Fayette County. And then xylazine was present in 23% of the syringes we tested in October, versus just 49 or 8% in September. And as has been the case in previous months, meth and fentanyl were the substances most frequently identified across all our sites in October. So just to break it down a little bit by county, in in October, we tested 86 syringes from partner sites in Fayette County. Meth and cocaine were the most frequently identified substances in syringes from Fayette County, with meth being in about 78% of the syringes and cocaine in about 72%. And then the top three notable contaminants found in syringes tested from Fayette County were lidocaine, which you can see here was in the top 10 substances overall. It was in about 22% of the syringes. And then xylazine and BTMPS. Xylazine is a veterinary tranquilizer that causes severe skin wounds and some withdrawal symptoms. And BTMPS is a plasticizer, and they were each found in two syringes, so about 2% of the syringes tested from Fayette County. And then for Jefferson County, 446 syringes had substances present in them. Fentanyl and meth were the two most frequently identified substances, with about 54% of the syringes containing fentanyl and about 51 containing methamphetamine. And then, as was true in Fayette County, lidocaine was in the top 10 substances overall, so was the most frequent or um, contaminant found. It was in 29% of the syringes that had substances in them tested from Jefferson County partner sites. I'm so sorry. I read that wrong. Xylazine was most frequent. Xylazine was in about 29% of the syringes, 130 syringes, and then lidocaine. So xylazine and lidocaine were both in that top 10 most frequently found substances from Jefferson County partner sites in October. And then medetomidine, which is another veterinary tranquilizer. It is not associated with skin wounds, but is associated with really severe withdrawal symptoms. In our November newsletter, had a section on medetomidine withdrawal syndrome. So if you're not subscribed to our newsletter, there will be a QR code at the end allowing you to subscribe. But I encourage you to subscribe. We've got lots of good information in there every month. And so medetomidine was in about 18% of the syringes that had substances in them from Jefferson County. And then we tested 68 syringes from Perry County. And meth and dimethyl sulfone were the substances most frequently identified in syringes tested from Perry County. Dimethyl sulfone is a popular cutting agent used in methamphetamine. So really after methamphetamine, amphetamine was the second most frequent psychoactive substance found. And Amanda, Kelly, Mike, please feel free to jump into the chat and correct me if I said anything wrong. And then the top two notable contaminants found in Perry County were xylazine, which was found in about 9% of the syringes we test or that had substances in them, and medetomidine, which again was in about 9% of those syringes. And then I just wanted to highlight 6-month trends. So you can see that xylazine and BTMPS and medetomidine have kind of slowly been increasing until this month, and then you saw a drop in medetomidine and a pretty stark increase in xylazine. And something that I remember Kelly, who works in our lab, saying in one of our meetings is that most most, if not all, and Kelly, again, please feel free to elaborate in the chat, but that in October, syringes that had medetomidine present in them also were very likely to have xylazine present in them. Um, Now is probably a good time to remind everyone that we don't know when we test syringes and get the residue results back whether that means that these substances were used together. We just know that they were all present in the syringe. So,
Casey, we have a question in the chat.
yes, okay. Let me find the chat. Yes, Kelly says they came paired very often in October.
There's a question, I think, about the dimethyl sulfone, if you could explain more about what that was.
Yeah, so it is a cutting agent that's used to like bulk up meth. So it doesn't, my understanding is that it doesn't have any like psychoactive properties. So it's not impacting people's experience of using the meth. It just bulks it up. And Amanda, I don't know if you have anything to add, or Kelly, anyone, feel free to drop in the chat. But it is a substance that is frequently found in meth. So it's not particularly surprising that in a county where meth was overwhelmingly the most frequently identified substance, that dimethyl sulfone was also in a lot of those syringes. Yes, and Kelly says some people have used it as a supplement, but it doesn't have any FDA approved uses. Danielle, I see your question about whether it's making meth-induced psychosis worse. I don't have an answer for you right now, but I'm happy to do research and email you if you want to drop your email in the chat, or I can drop my email and the hub email in the chat as well. Sorry. Yeah, and Kelly says that she hasn't seen it increase meth-induced psychosis. She's seen it as a cutting agent for 20 plus years. And I'm glad that you asked about meth-induced psychosis because that does play into kind of some of the overamping stuff that we will talk about later. So I appreciate you bringing that up. And Brooke, thanks for dropping those emails. Um, all right. And then you can see that we did see, again, an increase in xylazine this month, and then slight increase in fentanyl and a slight decrease in meth's presence overall in what we've tested in October, just on the 6-month trends. Sorry, I'm trying to keep up with the chat and do the presentation, so I'm sorry if I'm a little like slow or staggered. All right, so we wanted to talk about lidocaine as a contaminant today because it was, as I said, the 7th most commonly identified substance in syringes overall across all sites in October. So lidocaine is a local anesthetic. It's used to address pain in various medical and dental procedures. And there are lots of other local anesthetics. They're called the canes, so Procaine, Tetracaine. Some of these have also been present in the syringes that we tested. They all have similar impacts on the body. Lidocaine and other local anesthetics have been found in the drug supply for a really long time, for decades, primarily as a cutting agent used in cocaine. But what's interesting is we are seeing it in syringes that have also tested positive for fentanyl a lot more frequently now, and that is a trend that has been on the rise throughout the country, not just here in Kentucky. So why lidocaine? Lidocaine mimics and increases those euphoric effects, both of cocaine and of opioids. So it helps people to feel less pain, to feel that euphoria or like dreaminess. Um, and so it can, my understanding is that it can extend or it can enhance the feeling of the drug itself. And particularly in the case of fentanyl, I believe um, there are some people who say it extends that half-life as well and makes it last a little longer. It makes those effects last a little longer. Um, but it can impact the cardiovascular and central nervous systems at varying degrees, depending on how much is used. And so some signs and symptoms of lidocaine or other local anesthetic overdose or poisoning include dizziness, nausea, and seizures. It does look, as I was reading about it, I found it does sound, and it makes sense since it has been used to mimic those effects of cocaine for decades. It sounds like a lot of the overdose or poisoning symptoms for local anesthetics are very similar to overamping symptoms, which is why I'm going to talk about overamping next. All right. So overamping, for anyone who has not heard the term before, is a term that's used by harm reductionists and people who use drugs to describe what happens when someone overdoses on stimulants like meth or cocaine. We use overamping just to differentiate it from overdose because I think particularly over the past 15 or 20 years, when people hear overdose, they think of respiratory depression and being unconscious and all of the signs and symptoms that we associate with overdose on opioids. So referring to it as overamping is just a way to distinguish it from opioid overdose. So overamping can happen for a number of reasons, including taking more drugs or stronger drugs than you usually do, mixing stimulants with other drugs, and then not sleeping for several days or not eating or hydrating properly while using stimulants. So, some signs and symptoms include nausea or vomiting, tightness or pain in the chest, fever, sweating and chills, increased heart rate, headaches, convulsions, tremors, or seizures, teeth grinding, insomnia, or if someone has been up for days and days and days and using stimulants for that time and hasn't had sleep, passing out asleep but still breathing. Anxiety, feelings of anxiety and panic, and feelings of hypervigilance or paranoia, irritability and mood swings, hallucinations, and in extreme cases, it can cause stroke or a heart attack. So it's important to know the signs and know how to respond to it. So the first thing I want to say is there is no naloxone for overamping. So there's no medication that you can give someone that is going to like block the receptors for stimulants in their brain. But so some general tips, if you know someone has been using stimulants or you're not sure if they've been using stimulants, but they seem paranoid, nauseous, dizzy, they're telling you they feel cold, they have chills. You want to remain calm, speak to them in a calm, level tone, offer water or a sports drink, something to get their electrolytes up and get them hydrated. If you're inside and can open a window for ventilation, that would be great. And if possible, try to locate the person to somewhere that's cool, dark, and quiet, somewhere that isn't going to feel overwhelming, isn't going to increase the headache symptoms, isn't going to make them feel like they need to be hypervigilant and looking out for anything that could potentially happen, just somewhere that feels safe and quiet and cool. And then watch for signs of seizure, which can include drooling, falling over, having issues controlling bladder, muscle spasms, body stiffness. And if you think someone is having a seizure and that seizure is lasting more than 5 minutes, or if you know it's the person's first seizure, or if you don't know this person and you're unsure if it's their first seizure, call 911. And then, regardless of whether you call 911 or not, when someone is having a seizure, you want to turn them onto one side, loosen any tight clothing. So, like loosen ties, if they're wearing like a choker, try to get that off, unbutton cuffs, things like that. And again, remain calm. Just be there for that person. Make sure that they are not choking on their own saliva or vomit. Make sure that they are comfortable, or as comfortable as they can be. And then you also want to watch for signs of stroke, including numbness, particularly on one side of the body, any dizziness, any trouble seeing or speaking. And if you think someone is having a stroke, particularly if they are describing having that numbness on one side of their body, it's important to call 911 and get them medical attention. And then again, watch for signs of a heart attack, including pain or pressure, any tightness in the chest, any discomfort in the neck, jaw, back, or stomach, or anywhere else in the body, shortness of breath, and feeling lightheaded, all those symptoms together. And again, if you think someone might be having a heart attack, call 911. But I do have I know that a lot of the response here is just call 911 or look out for symptoms and call 911. But I do have some recommendations to consider if you do call 911. First of all, you want to inform the person who's overamping that you're going to call 911 if they're awake and conscious, particularly if they are describing feeling paranoid or anxious. You want to make sure that they are aware of what's happening around them and that you're not just going to ambush them or surprise them with the arrival of EMS or police or any other first responders. Um, and just like we do with opioid overdose, inform the 911 operator of the symptoms the person is experiencing, but don't mention drugs. Just you can say, I have a friend who has been having muscle spasms and drooling. I think they might be having a seizure. I have a friend who is saying that they have numbness on one side of their body. I'm worried they're having a stroke. My friend is feeling a lot of chest pain. I think they may be having a heart attack. You don't need to mention drugs, and we don't want to give any 911 dispatchers or first responders any reason to take a little longer to get a unit out. Um, and then a note on the Good Samaritan law. The Good Samaritan law in Kentucky does cover calling 911 for drug overdoses, and I would argue that overamping situations are drug overdoses. But because we do, as a general population, tend to think of overdose as opioid overdose or overdose symptoms that we associate with depressants in general, like not breathing, like unconsciousness, um, then you just don't know whether like this is going to be classified by the first responders as an overdose or a stroke, a seizure, or a heart attack. So I really recommend doing your best to get rid of any substances or paraphernalia before EMS arrive and to let everyone else know that 911 has been called if there are other people with you, so people can make the best decisions for themselves to keep themselves safe. We, of course, want to make sure that if someone is experiencing a medical emergency, be it a seizure, a stroke, or a heart attack, that they get the medical attention that they need. But I'm just offering these recommendations because I would hate for someone to call 911 and also get into trouble for having substances or paraphernalia around. So I just want to encourage people to be as safe and thoughtful as possible when calling 911 in an overamping situation, including, again, making sure that you've let the person who's overamping know that you're calling 911, you haven't mentioned drugs to the operator, and that you are taking care to make sure that nothing illegal is visible in the vicinity so that you and the person who's overamping are as protected as possible. And that is everything I have for the hub today. You can scan the QR code to sign up for our newsletters and our alerts. We will put out alerts about new contaminants that are identified from time to time. And then please feel free to email us with any questions at ukharmreductionhub@uky.edu. Oh, I've got a Evan, thanks. Thanks. That's a great question. Evan asked, wouldn't it be important to retain some of the substance in case there's mystery about how to treat them at the hospital? Yeah, that is a great point. And I think that, when EMS arrives, you can say, hey, my friend took cocaine, my friend took meth, etc., and let them know what's going on. The not mentioning drugs is more about being on the phone with a 911 operator. You just want to avoid any potential that stigma comes into play when they're dispatching a unit. And yes, thank you, Amanda. We don't make any official legal recommendations. These are not official legal recommendations. These are just tips from someone who used to use drugs and has worked in harm reduction for a long time. Sorry, I should have been more clear about that up front.
Thank you so much, Casey. Great information, and but don't go far because you're also about to present on how sex work can impact recovery with Dr. Hartley Feld, and I'll just introduce Hartley real quick. Dr. Hartley Feld is an associate professor at the University of Kentucky College of Nursing. She works at the intersection of women's health and substance use disorder. Her goals are to promote autonomy, health, well-being, and empowerment of women both in the community and in getting the care they deserve in healthcare. So, welcome, Dr. Feld, and hello again, Casey.
Hello, I'm getting ready to share this screen now. Um, all right, let me get the slideshow going. Thanks everyone for bearing with me as I toggle between various screens. All right, so like Brooke said, Hartley and I are here today to present on sex work and its impact on recovery capital. Um, Based on some qualitative research Hartley did with women who use drugs and did sex work in rural Pennsylvania, which you'll hear more about in just a minute. Before we get started, I did want to just give some like content warnings and reminders. So we will touch on violence and sexual assault and substance use, of course, and sex work in general. And we will talk about coercion in sex work as well. I know that everyone here is an adult. I know that you all are very good at taking care of yourselves, but just a reminder that, like, if something is making you uncomfortable and you need a break, you need to walk away, grab a glass of water, whatever, we are not going to be offended. So please take care of yourself throughout this presentation. And then just a reminder again, I know that Brooke said it up front, but there will be a survey at the end. It'll take about 15 minutes to complete, and anyone who completes it will get a $25 gift card sent to their home. So stick around at the end to take that survey. Hartley, do you have anything to add before I get into the agenda? All right. Okay, so we'll start with introductions and objectives, and then give an overview of the study. Then we'll talk about the focus group feedback and results, what we heard about sex work's impact on recovery capital. And then we will talk about how folks who work in peer positions can enhance recovery support for individuals with a history of sex work. And we'll have some time for Q&A and the surveys, and that'll be it for today. All right, so today's objectives, we hope that after this presentation, you are able to describe the 4 pillars of reproductive well-being, describe the 3 C's of sex work, define recovery capital, and explain the BARC-10, which is the most common tool for measuring it, and then discuss intersections of reproductive well-being, sex work, and recovery capital as they apply to your work. All right, so we will get into the study overview and methodology. I'll hand it off to Hartley.
Hi there. Can you hear me? Casey, you can tell me. Okay, perfect. Thanks for joining us. We've had the pleasure of working with in some spaces where sex work is relatively common, and we've really realized that in the literature and in the academic side, when we're looking for articles and research about this, that we're seeing a lot of like the criminal legal aspects as it relates to sex work for people with substance use disorder. Or we're seeing some things about sex work in like humanitarian and crisis settings, but we really haven't seen anybody examine this through the lens of harm reduction and with a human rights lens as well. We are our initial goal is to kind of disrupt some earlier paradigms related to focusing so much on criminology as it relates to sex work, and to lift up the voices and stories of people who do sex work, particularly those who are in rural communities who might have additional barriers to recovery and recovery capital based on rurality. And we really hadn't seen much of that in our like academic literature or that people are studying. And so we can go to the next one. Sorry, Casey's controlling the slides. One of the other reasons we really wanted to investigate this is thanks to the work of Amanda Fallon Bennett and Martha Tilson with the JCOIN study. We learned quite a bit about what incarcerated women with opioid use disorder, what some of the like nuances between transactional sex and sexual exploitation, what the impact of that could be on recovery capital. So their findings, which is unpublished right now, but it's been submitted for publication, so we'll be sure to share that with you later. But they found that 44% of participants, and these are incarcerated women, had ever engaged in transactional sex. And they define transactional sex as sex with a partner in exchange for things like money, drugs, food, shelter, or transportation. And overall, this did not seem to be a risk for lower recovery capital. So if you've had transactional sex in the past, it didn't seem to impact whether or not your recovery capital was high or low. It didn't seem to have as much of an impact. However, once we got into sexual exploitation, 23% of the people in their study, which I forget, I think it was about 600 women, did say that they had a history of sexual exploitation, and they define that as force, fraud, and coercion. And those are words that you might see in other spaces that are also related to human trafficking. And we're going to kind of use mostly terminology related to sexual exploitation or coercion. And this had a significant impact on recovery capital. So if you were a victim of sexual exploitation, you had lower recovery capital. And this is just one point in time of incarcerated women. So it doesn't mean that you will always have lower recovery capital, but it might mean that you have some additional issues going on that could be addressed, for instance, in recovery spaces or in peer recovery coaching. So what was kind of amazing about this is that it had more of a relationship to recovery capital than any other psychosocial variable. So more so than psychological health, physical health, civic engagement, and social support. And so we were kind of blown away that that was such a large predictor of lower recovery capital. And so it highlights the need for screening and healthcare and recovery services to identify the risks associated with sexual exploitation. So that was one of the reasons that we wanted to do this study, is because we were starting to see this data come out from our colleagues, and we wanted to understand more about how sex work and recovery capital intersected. And then we did this in Pennsylvania because we had a research assistant with lived experience with both substance use disorder and sex work who worked in Pennsylvania, and she had access to this group of recovery community centers called the Hub, and it was 22 counties in rural Appalachia. And we were interested in how rural settings might differ in terms of recovery capital. We're hoping that it translates well to Kentucky, considering our Appalachian population here as well, and some of the rurality constraints and barriers that people might have. God, sorry. So we did 14 focus. We did 5 focus groups with 14 participants, and they were about 90 minutes long. So they were pretty in depth, and people really shared a lot. All of the focus groups participants had experience of sex work and were people in recovery, and they worked in peer support settings. We went over some definitions to start with to kind of make sure we were all on the same page, and then got into the weeds further about what we think could support or be challenges for recovery. So just a heads up that some of the limitations of our study were that these were exploratory. It's quite small. All the participants were white women, which we really couldn't control because we tried to recruit from all 22 sites. And they largely identified as heterosexual. And we want to acknowledge that the challenges will likely be greater and more complex for people in the LGBTQ community. And we didn't fully explore that, although a lot of people did bring it up in our discussion. So we were able to kind of have some information about that. And then we hope that it translates to Kentucky, but it may or may not because they're from Pennsylvania. And we did focus mostly on in-person sex work. We didn't explore the impact of online sex work on recovery, but some people did bring it up a little bit because it's so common now with that online sex work seems to be picking up, especially in rural communities. Okay, and then we're going to go over some of the tools and definitions that we used in our study, and also just to give kind of a little background for each of those. So I'll do the reproductive well-being, and then I'll pass it over to Casey. For those of you who remember me from some of our other work, we're really focused on how this notion of well-being, for particularly for women, can impact their recovery. And so this intersects really with sex work, because we want, if people are doing sex work, we think the same tools that are true for preventing or planning a pregnancy are also true for sex work. So it's the ideal situation is that all people have reproductive well-being, and it means that all people have equitable access to information, services, and systems of support that they need to have control over their bodies and make their own decisions related to sex, sexuality, and reproduction throughout their lives. And so it doesn't just have to do with making, getting pregnant or not. We want to make sure and ensure that people have autonomy and decision-making power sits with the individual, that they have control, that they receive a full range of information and can make informed decisions, and that they're seen and heard and understood both in healthcare spaces and in the community, and that pillar is respect, and then that they have systems of support so that they are aligned with reproductive well-being. And that means not judging people for sex work and not creating like a moral or criminal language surrounding sex work, and so that they have systems of support so that people will support them no matter where they are in that trajectory. Okay, passing it off to Casey. Thank you.
Thanks, Hartley. Sorry. Sorry about that. So the definition that was shared with the focus group participants of sex work is exchanging things, resources, or needs for sex. So that is how we define sex work for the purpose of the research. And we also acknowledge that sex work can be beneficial, harmful, or somewhere in between. And then the three C's continuum. So before I introduce the three C's continuum, which is a tool that it kind of explains why people engage in sex work, I just wanted to remind people of other continuums that we use in harm reduction. So we are used to talking about substance use as being on a continuum or a spectrum, right? From none to chaotic, with lots of options or ways that people use substances in between, whether it's social, recreational, chronic, compulsive, etc. And we are also used to thinking about the ways that people can stay safe when they're using substances on a continuum or a spectrum, right? So things like, we know that the safest option may be to not use substances for some people, but if they are using substances, we want to make sure that they're remaining safe while doing so. So encouraging them to use with other people, to use sterile syringes, to test their drugs, if they have access to a safer consumption site, to use that, right? So there are lots of ways to make a risky behavior a little safer. And we're used to talking about that as it relates to substance use, as harm reductionists and people who work with people who use drugs. So there's a similar continuum developed by people who do sex work and other advocates for sex workers, called the three C's continuum, which visualizes sex work as being on a continuum from choice to circumstance to coercion, with again, a lot of gray area in between. I made our continuum look like a Venn diagram because we know there's a lot of overlap, right? So choice, someone who's like all the way to the left of this continuum, all the way fully in choice, is fully consenting to sex work, even if there are other employment options. It's what they choose to do. It's what they want to do. Circumstance is engaging in sex work because it's providing someone with what they need right now. So maybe they wouldn't do sex work if they had another job that paid as much or had flexible hours, but sex work is meeting the needs that they have right now. Or maybe it's as simple as the circumstance is they need to pay their rent this month, and so they're doing sex work. They need to buy some drugs, so they're doing sex work, right? And then coercion, which is being tricked, forced, or pressured to trade sex by someone else. And so coercion, all the way at the opposite end from choice of the spectrum, does include trafficking. But we also acknowledge that there are blurry lines and gray areas even within coercion, right? The example I gave when Hartley and I gave a presentation a few months ago is when I was doing sex work, there were times when a partner would say, like, hey, why don't you just, or not just, but what if you slept with the person we're buying drugs from so that we could get drugs that way? And it's like, yes, because someone was suggesting it, there was a little bit of a coercive element, but there also was a choice I was making. And like circumstantially, I wanted those drugs too, right? So just understanding that all of this is a gray area, and that it can be difficult to parse out what is choice, what is circumstance, what is coercion at times. And particularly, we all have to work to live. That is all of our circumstances. So even people who are in choice might, under different economic circumstances, feel differently. Hartley, do you have anything to add before I move on? And then the BARC 10, I know a lot of folks on this webinar are familiar with the BARC 10, but it is the Brief Assessment of Recovery Capital 10. So it is a self-assessment tool, and the goal of it is to measure strengths and assets a person possesses over 10 domains of recovery. And the 10 domains of recovery across the BARC 10 are substance use and sobriety, psychological health, physical health, civic and community engagement, coping and life functioning, meaningful activities, housing status, risk-taking behavior, recovery experience, and social support. All right, so for some participant insights, after we gave them these definitions and models, we asked them for some feedback, what they thought of them. Overall, participants liked our definition of sex work. They had no issues with our definition, and did not push back on it. Nobody seemed unfamiliar with the concept of sex work. In terms of the three C's model, overall, participants liked the three C's model and felt that it resonated for them based on their own experiences or experiences of people they knew with sex work. There were a couple participants across the focus groups, two across the focus groups, that did voice that they always viewed sex work, or almost always viewed sex work as being coercive. But overall, people did say that they understood the three C's model, they liked it, they agreed that sex work kind of falls somewhere within a spectrum from choice to circumstance to coercion. A lot of the conversations that were had throughout the focus groups did focus on circumstance and coercion more than choice, but largely people agreed that they understood that sex work kind of falls across that spectrum. Nobody who participated in the focus groups was familiar with the three C's model prior to the focus group, but we got a lot of positive feedback on it. And then the BARC 10, participants universally expressed positive reactions to the BARC 10 when it was first introduced. As the discussion continued, some critiques came up, and we'll get into those throughout this presentation. But people in general, when it was presented to them, really liked it. A lot of the focus group participants who had previously been unfamiliar with it talked about integrating it into their own work. Only one participant was familiar with the BARC 10 prior to the focus group. All right, so now we can get into some of the feedback and results from the focus group. Sorry, I'm just going to check the chat. Great. Okay. So in terms of the BARC 10 and sex work's impact on recovery capital, I kind of pulled out some feedback we got on each of the 10 domains of the BARC 10. So in terms of substance use and recovery, we heard a lot about people for whom sex work was inherently linked to their substance use, whether it was because they were engaging in sex work so that they could buy drugs or afford drugs, or because it was just really linked to a time when they were using chaotically and psychologically. The two just felt attached. And then for some focus groups who began using drugs at a young age, they talked about sex itself, not just sex work, including sex work, but not limited to, being like inherently linked to substance use for them. There were a lot of rich discussions about like I don't know that relearning is the right word, but like people needing time to heal and recover before they could engage in a sexual relationship at all, in early recovery. And then psychological health, for those who were more towards the choice end of the spectrum. Sex work, we heard a lot about how sex work was an empowering way to provide for themselves in early recovery. And I'll get more into that later as well. And then for people who were doing sex work because of circumstance or coercion, we heard a lot about shame and fear that was damaging to psychological health if when they continued to do sex work while in early recovery. I will say also, I didn't put this on here, but we certainly heard about people who were doing sex work due to circumstance who felt more aligned with the it's empowering. It helped me provide for myself in early recovery too. It's just circumstance, the middle of that spectrum is where people started being like, there are times when it didn't feel so good psychologically. Um, and then we also heard a lot, I think almost every focus group, there was a discussion about feeling wanted in early recovery and sex work for some people being a way to feel confident in their bodies and wanted. And so I included that in the psychological health domain as well. In terms of physical health, we heard a lot about safety and staying safe while continuing to do sex work, but not but, and what stood out to me were we heard even more than safety concerns directly related to sex work. We heard a lot of stories about the fear and anxiety about going to the doctor in early recovery and saying that you were a sex worker or even asking to be tested for STIs, and discomfort around disclosing to health providers. So we heard that for a lot of folks, it was hard to maintain their physical health while continuing to do sex work in early recovery because of how highly stigmatized it is. And again, I'll talk more about that in a bit. In terms of civic and community engagement, because these focus groups were taking place in a fairly rural environment, we heard a lot about how living in these small towns or rural areas, being known as a sex work, made it really difficult to engage with the community, whether that was attending PTA meetings because someone's husband was a client, or even we heard stories of, like it's hard to get a rental when you have a criminal legal interactions in your background in general. And then when there is like small town gossip and people know that it was due to sex work related or drug related things, it can be even harder to find a place to live, to find a job, etc. And then for coping and life functioning, again, for some, it really helped them to achieve stability. They were able to pay their rent, buy groceries, provide for their families. And then for others, there were those psychological impacts where it just made it harder and they were living in fear and shame. And particularly for folks who weren't able to engage with the community, it made it difficult to cope. Meaningful activities. We heard from one participant about the financial benefits of sex work and the scheduling flexibility and how that allowed her to spend more time with her children than working a lower paid hourly job might have. And so there were, again, some folks who were like, because of sex work, I am able to spend more time with my family. I'm able to spend more time with my friends. So it did offer them more opportunity to engage in activities that were meaningful to them. Housing status, I already spoke about housing discrimination, particularly for people with criminal legal backgrounds, but we also heard stories of landlords who were giving people a place to stay in exchange for sex, which helped some to stay housed in early recovery. And so that's an example of some that falls towards, in my opinion, the circumstance coercion end of the spectrum, but some people had varying opinions on it, right? Some people had that experience and were like, it helped me to stay stable, to know that I had a place to live. And some people, in retrospect, did not feel as good about those experiences. In terms of risk-taking behavior, people talked about their concerns about sex work being an inherently risky behavior, particularly for people who had histories of incarceration or other criminal legal involvement or involvement with child protective services. I believe one person spoke about not engaging in illegal activities being a big part of their recovery, and so sex work being inherently detrimental to recovery from their perspective because it was an illegal activity. We also heard about differences about being on the street, being a full service sex work who's on the street, working at truck stops, etc., versus dancing or even escorting, where people were able to be out in public. There were more people around. being in those more hidden places made it a lot more difficult for folks to stay safe. And then again, there were lots of really fruitful conversations about the risk level, depending on whether it was done by choice or due to circumstance or coercion. People talked about, being able to make better choices for themselves if they knew that they had other clients and the capacity to walk away versus whether they were struggling to make ends meet that month and or there was someone else who was encouraging them to engage in sex work and the consequences that might have happened had they just said, no, this situation isn't safe, I'm going to walk away. In terms of recovery experience, um, something we heard quite a bit throughout the focus groups is that people um, seemed more, and again, not everyone, but a lot of the participants of the focus group like seemed to or expressed that they felt like sex work might be harder to engage in early recovery because whether it was because it was a riskier illegal activity, whether it was because the people they knew who were doing sex work were still using drugs, but they felt like a lot of folks said that once they achieved stability or once they had clients who achieved stability, they could have an easier time picturing doing sex work again once they felt confident in their recovery. And then again, this is a theme that I know has come up a lot already, but others talked about how doing sex work as they were in early recovery was really helpful because it helped them achieve that stability because you need money to be stable. And then as for social support, for some, the stigma associated with sex work made it difficult to find social support networks, particularly again in those small towns, rural areas, where people were aware of them as sex workers. But we did also hear stories of people who talked about how connecting with other people who were doing sex work or with people who were advocating for sex workers helped them to build a new social network and more social support. Someone talked about how connecting with other sex workers and advocates was really helpful to her because she then had people around her who would remind her that she was safe and help her to stay safe. So really varied. Oof, sorry about the weird overlap here. So we also had a lot of discussions. I mean, the theme of the focus groups was about whether engaging in sex work positively or negatively impacted recovery. But what we heard was, of course, we did hear about some people who felt very strongly that doing sex work could uplift or empower recovery, and people who felt that it could damage it. But most of the feedback we heard fell somewhere in the middle. Whether it was just totally neutral, it's just another job, or there was more gray area and nuance than just it is helpful or it is hurtful. So I'm going to take you through some of that feedback. So in terms of the positive feedback or the people who felt that sex work could positively impact recovery, it fell into three main groups. The first one, I don't think you'll surprise me based on my breakdown of the BARC 10, or I don't think you'll find it surprising based on my BARC 10 breakdown, was financial stability and flexibility. So some quotes I pulled out. Someone said that sex work could be really empowering for people as a protective mechanism because you had income, you could make your own hours, you could choose how you were spending your time. We heard a story from someone who knew someone who continued doing sex work in early recovery or throughout her recovery and saved money and was able to put herself through law school using that money. Um, and then we heard other stories about people who were doing full service sex work who continued to do so in recovery. And because of that, were able to rent apartments, to make sure their kids had really fun holidays, regardless of not using anymore. So that financial stability was definitely a huge element for people who felt that sex work could be empowering and could help people as they were recovering from substance use disorders. We also heard a lot about confidence and agency, people talked about taking their sexuality back, being in control of the situation, particularly again for people who got into recovery and then like had the choice to continue doing sex work and made that choice. We heard a lot about people feeling like they had more power and control over their sex work and the ways in which they engaged in sex work than they did when they were using. Um, and so that felt good and felt like a confidence builder for folks. And then again, that community element. So we heard about people who were able to connect with other sex workers or with people who were advocating for sex work decriminalization or legalization, and how building those connections helped them to feel a sense of belonging at a time when they were maybe losing some of the connections with people that they knew when they were using. Hartley, do you have anything to add here? Also, feel free to jump in at any time too. Okay, and then for people, and then some of the more neutral or mixed bag feedback we got, I broke into, again, 3 categories. So the risk level and environmental impact was the first. So um, someone brought up in one of the focus groups how sex work may be empowering, may not be empowering in early recovery, and that a big piece of whether it was helpful or hurtful would be whether sex work was part of the reason that, or was tied to their substance use or other risk-taking behaviors inherently or not, whether it was something that they could separate out from their substance use. Um, and then we also heard about like nuances between different types of sex work. So if someone had a community and knew other full service sex workers, it might make full service sex work a little safer. If someone was dancing and didn't have relationships with the people that they were working with, then it could feel very isolating. Whereas, again, if someone was dancing and was familiar with the folks in that club and felt like they had a support around them, it could be helpful. So just the environment in which sex work was taking place and the number of connections and so amount of social support seemed to be a really big factor in whether people felt it was helpful or hurtful to recovery. And then uh, people talked about how it's difficult to recover whether you're doing sex work or not, and that stigma related to former substance use exists independently of sex work. They talked about how, particularly in those conversations we had about sex work, and disclosing sex work to medical professionals, people brought up that it's uncomfortable to disclose former substance use to medical professionals. And that regardless of whether they disclosed that they were engaging in sex work or not, if they said that they were in recovery from substance use, they would still be treated as pill seeking, as med seeking, right? And be judged as a former substance user. Um, and so, yeah, just a lot of conversation about healthcare and stigma from healthcare workers and whether the stigma of being a sex work compounded the stigma of being a former substance user or someone who formerly used substances, or kind of did the stigma attached to having a chaotic substance use disorder was enough that the sex work stigma didn't even register, I guess. Um, and then we also heard a lot about honesty and willingness to be transparent with yourself and others being a big element in recovery. And so we heard a lot of people say that like they felt like there were circumstances under which sex work could be empowering and could be helpful to building recovery capital, but those people would have to, but it was a lot of the people who talked about this felt it was a rarity because of the level of discipline and clarity and structure that people would have to be building in their own lives in order to engage in sex work and engage meaningfully in recovery. Um, Someone talked about truth telling being the most important thing in building their own personal recovery capital, and so it being very dependent as to whether people were able to be open about their sex work with family, friends, social supports or not, and how being open versus not being open about what you are doing to make money might impact your recovery capital. Um, and then people talked about that emotional element of recovery and how they'd been using substances to ease guilt and shame. And so if there was internalized guilt or internalized stigma related to sex work independent of their substance use, then it could be hard for sex work to feel empowering. Whereas if people felt good about doing sex work, then it could be much easier for sex work to contribute to that recovery capital. And then in terms of the folks who felt that sex work would have a, a negative or damaging impact on recovery capital, um, these people fell into four categories. So impacts to psychological and physical health. So people talked about how if people, even for folks who felt that who are doing sex work by choice, there is still a level of risk taking. And if someone were to get into a situation that was triggering for them, then the inclination might be to return to substance use. And then kind of on the flip side of what I talked about earlier when I was talking about the BARC-10 and the confidence and people feeling desired, contributing to their confidence, you know, there were conversations about like that feeling good in the moment for some people, and then afterwards feeling like, man, that person really just wanted me for sex. I don't feel as good as I did in that moment, and how that impacted psychological health. People talked a lot about exposure to substances and continued association with substances or people who are using substances when folks were in early recovery. So someone talked about how, multiple people talked about, but a quote I pulled out from someone talking about how their sex work was just inherently linked to their substance use was that she said she couldn't imagine doing the things she did to survive before, and she certainly couldn't imagine doing them clean. So, um, that's a direct quote. So, just associating sex work with substance use made it very difficult for people to continue on in that emotional recovery in some cases. And then again, there was talk of like maybe kind of in opposition to the other conversations that we heard about, like maybe someone could take a break from sex work while they're building recovery capital and return when they're a little bit more confident in their recovery. We did hear a reverse of that from some people as well, and some people talking about how, like, yeah, sex work felt really good in early recovery because they were building that stability, but then once they reached that stability, feeling a lot more of that internal shame and stigma and feeling like they wanted to address some of that shame and stigma with substances. Um, and then again, that question of whether sex work was inherently linked to or inherently linked for people to substance use or not, and that playing a really big role in the kind of impact it might have on building recovery capital. And then another thing that came up time and again was the risk of criminalization. And so just whether it was worth risking losing your house, your job, um, being involved again or for the first time with the criminal legal system by choosing to or by doing sex work, whether it was by choice, circumstance, or coercion, and whether that like whether the benefits of doing sex work in terms of building recovery capital did or did not outweigh the risks involved. All right. And then we heard a lot about rural considerations, which was interesting for me coming from a place where, most of the work that I've done has been in more urban or suburban environments. So we heard a lot about how like there can be more stigma and shame, both like external and internal, related to sex work in rural areas because it's a smaller environment and people know other people and are in their business. And there is also less opportunity for new community supports if you have lived in a community your whole life and it's small and you feel like you know everyone. We also heard about how there were fewer recovery resources, fewer housing opportunities, and fewer jobs. And then transportation was a big theme over and over again. Not being able to get to the doctor, not being able to get to resources that were to MOUD programs, to like having to figure out how to get to a potential apartment to see it, having to figure out how to get to work if you don't have transportation, and that lack of transportation being a really big barrier to recovery in rural environments. And then we had a lot of conversations, as I said, as when I was talking about the BARC-10 and folks' reactions to the tools that we presented. We heard a lot about the limitations of the BARC-10 and some domains that folks felt were missing or that the BARC-10 didn't sufficiently address were safety, and particularly safety related to gender and sexuality, criminalization and legal risks, and then access to healthcare being kind of a separate category from health itself. Um, so just to ground us in some statistics, and thank you to Cindy Clay from HIPS. We pulled these statistics from a presentation she did 2 years ago at the Kentucky Harm Reduction Summit. So there are an estimated 1 to 2 million full service sex workers in the US. Um, Between 70 and 80,000 sex work related arrests are made annually in the US. It's estimated that anywhere from 45 to 75% of sex workers in the United States experience sexual violence. 70% of sex work arrests involve female sex workers or female third parties, whether so managers or drivers or security. Most forms of sex work are criminalized across the US, and sex workers report violence not only from clients, but from managers and law enforcement officers as well. So sex work is not a field where necessarily people are going to be going to law enforcement if they have been assaulted, if they feel unsafe. And that, of course, adds layers to the nuances of talking about safety in sex work.
Casey, we've got a something in the chat, and
Yeah.
it goes back to what you were saying about how that feeling of shame and internalized stigma can make people want to use again. And so Jamie shared a little bit of her lived experience. She says, for me, alcohol and or substances was an escape. But what I didn't realize back then, I was just prolonging dealing with all those issues, feelings, trauma, in a way to process it and kind of make peace with it, rather than carry that pain and bitterness around with me. It took me many years, but I'm grateful, better late than never.
Yeah. Thank you, Jamie. Thanks so much for sharing that. It's so great to hear about people's personal experiences. I appreciate you sharing. All right, I'm going to try to speed through because I want to make sure people have time to take their surveys. So I won't go through all the quotes, but basically people said that they felt the BARC 10 lacked a domain for safety, including physical safety, whether people were being harmed, exposed to violent people, assaulted, psychological safety, and safety for their children and family, particularly if people had information that they could blackmail them with, etc. And then so many of the conversations came down to criminalization and a fear of criminalization and how the risk of criminalization could be really detrimental in early recovery. Um, there were also lots of conversations about the revolving door of criminalization, right? Like you have a background check, you can't get a job, you continue to do sex work because it's how you can make money and stay stable. You get arrested, you go back to jail or prison. And so that what we heard time and again is that it wasn't necessarily sex work itself that had a detrimental impact on recovery capital for a lot of people. It was knowing that there was such a huge risk of criminalization and of losing housing, job, freedom. And then again, we had a lot of conversations about stigma from healthcare providers and hesitancy to seek care because of fear of judgment from healthcare providers. Hartley, do you have anything you want to add before I move forward into the role of peer support?
No, you're doing great. And one of the things we just wanted to highlight as kind of a takeaway here is we were hoping to build some skills that you could use with your participants. And so we have some motivational interviewing examples of how to kind of walk through that and some harm reduction resources. So thanks, Casey. No, you did a great job. As you can imagine, we're quite passionate about this because listening to 90 minutes of the focus groups and people sharing very intimate details as you even in our chats, like we really want to uphold those voices and also, bring it forward because and make space for these conversations because we think that people are still kind of hiding in the shadows and that this could be really beneficial for their recovery. So thank you. No, you did a great job.
Thanks, Hartley. So just very quickly, some harm reduction resources and tools that I'm sure you all are all familiar with that could benefit folks who are doing sex work, regardless of whether they are using substances or not. Safer sex supplies and the whole range of them, not just external and internal condoms, but flavored condoms, lube, dental dams, physical resources that explain how to use these. We heard a lot about how excited people were to be thought of when their local recovery centers started offering flavored condoms or dental dams. Naloxone, particularly for people who are still in proximity to substance use, whether they're using themselves. HIV and hepatitis C rapid testing. We heard a lot about the how peers, people who are working as peers now, were able to have those really like intimate conversations as rapid testing was taking place, and that they were able to have those conversations that other like case managers or doctors or nurses might not be able to have because they could relate on a peer level. And then offering reproductive health supplies like pregnancy tests and period supplies, offering access to PEP and PrEP, offering legal support for people who have been criminalized, and then offering housing and economic assistance if possible. And then just some notes on harm reduction in practice. I just want to always emphasize that harm reduction is a practice. It's not something you like just decide you're doing. You have to practice harm reduction. And so again, going back to that, like the 3C spectrum and the spectrums around substance use and using and staying safe that I talked about earlier, just remembering that when you're talking with someone who's engaging in sex work, no matter where they are on that 3C's continuum, um, even if the safest option isn't available to them, like even if for them the safest option would be stopping doing sex work entirely, what are some ways that they could be safer? Have like a could they have a signal with a friend to alert them that they were in danger? Could they be carrying condoms? Could they be using flavored condoms for when they're performing oral sex? Just thinking creatively about ways to stay as safe as possible, no matter what you're doing. All right, and then motivational interviewing. So we always want to meet people where they are, whether they are meeting people where they are. So if sex work is working for people and serving functions that are in line with their recovery goals, we don't want to discourage them from doing that. We just want to have conversations and dialogues. And again, regardless of where people are in that spectrum, we want to help them make choices for themselves and not tell them what to do. So some motivational interviewing
Another
examples.
question sorry to interrupt you, a
No, you're
question
good.
asking if you have done any research or considered incarcerated women that do sex work and their ability to have recovery capital and make a choice upon reentry on whether they want to continue sex work or another career.
Wow, that is a really great question.
Yeah, I can lean into that, Carissa. I mean, really, Dr. Fallon Bennett's work is mostly what the Jay Coyne study was the one that we were talking about with incarcerated women. We're not sure how that translates to women who were not incarcerated, but we were assuming that, making some leaps that the coercive and exploitative versions of that would harm recovery capital based on their study for all women, but their study only reflected incarcerated women. I think that this could be a huge um, piece that could work in peer support to make the transition out of being incarcerated as to where and how they engage back in sex work, and if they know that the less control that they have over it, that it can impact their recovery if that's where they're heading. So we don't have plans to do that, but I think it's an awesome idea, and I think it's a space that could use some more conversations about this. So thank you for your question.
Yeah, thank you. All right, so we just had some examples of motivational interviewing, particularly in the context of someone working with someone who might be expressing that they're starting to feel less safe doing sex work or just expressing ambivalence about continuing in sex work, right? So the core of motivational interviewing to me is reflective listening. So just reflecting back what you hear people saying. So in this instance, you might say, I hear you talking about how sex work is becoming more dangerous for you. You've had some near misses in terms of safety, and there have been times where you haven't gotten paid for your work. And then amplifying that change talk, right? So if someone says like, "Yep, I've gotten hurt before. I was too high to notice the warning signs. I didn't get paid." So safety is really important to you. You said in this situation that being too high put you in danger because you weren't reading the situation well and you didn't get paid. Um, so then asking those open-ended questions to kind of evoke further conversation. So asking whether, like, what it might look like if someone used in a way that would help them cope with doing the work, but would not create such a dangerous situation or cause them to be ripped off. Um, and then, if someone responds to that and says they're not sure, they'd like to use less, maybe not using right before they work would be a good option. Then reflecting that back to them and supporting them in making their own choices, right? So thinking about cutting back or changing when you use are ways that you're saying you feel like you could stay safer, which would be easier to try first. And then how do you feel about trying that? And then, like, the next time you see them, you could say, like, hey, how did it go when you tried using a little earlier or using after you worked rather than using before you worked, right? Just making sure that you're not asking yes or no questions. You're leaving space for them to tell you about their experience and continue the conversation. And then, offering um, yeah, asking people their confidence level about making these decisions, and then checking in week to week or each time you see them, so that they feel supported and that they can continue having these conversations, and can change their behavior when the timing is right for them with your support and encouragement. I do also want to emphasize that boundaries are important in these conversations. Your safety and well-being as peers matters. You can care very deeply and still have boundaries. So, you do not need to like an example I give a lot when I do trainings is like if someone is showing up if you have an appointment with someone and they're consistently showing up an hour late for their appointment time, a good boundary to set is, hey, I can't meet with you if you aren't able to make your appointment time. And then you can use the same motivational interviewing techniques. You can ask, like, what is it that is difficult for you about making your appointment time? Is it like, is the bus not running on time? Could you leave earlier? Would it be helpful to move our appointment time back an hour, et cetera? Like, you can still apply the motivational interviewing in setting your own boundaries and keep yourself and your participant safe. And then I wanted to talk about safety planning. And Hartley, please feel free to jump in at any point here too. So we want to make sure that people are able to recognize signs of intimate partner violence and abuse, including controlling where people go and what they do, monitoring phone, taking control of a person's money, threatening the person or their children or pets, obviously physical violence, isolation from friends and family, and jealousy and possessiveness. So it also is really important to emphasize that people are more like violence is likely to escalate when an abusive partner realizes that their partner is making plans to leave their relationship. So you want to be careful about encouraging people to just leave right away. We don't want to put people in any more danger. But you do want to encourage people to trust their instincts, to have their phone charged, to know what exits they can take, to leave a situation safely, to have the important documentations they may need to get housing or other resources available, encouraging folks to think about savings and an emergency cash stash, identifying safe places nearby, whether that is the recovery center you work at or a women's shelter, or I mean, there are many options for safe places, but talking about those places with your participants, making a plan. And then we also have some resources, some confidential hotlines here, the National Domestic Violence Hotline, Sexual Assault Hotline, Suicide Prevention, the Trans Lifeline, just places that people can call if they are experiencing abuse and need further support. Hartley, do you have anything to add about safety planning?
No, I mean, there's actually not a lot that we could find that is specific for people who engage in sex work. So some of this is related to intimate partner violence, and I mean, it's different, but there's some overlap of things that you could do to help keep people safe. And we have heard that some of the little green box of keep this info hidden, that sometimes that's their peer support where
Yeah.
they can go and keep all their contact or money hidden, and that's a person who might know where and how to help them. But also, it's just a best practice to try to have like three people that you can communicate with in times of an emergency, and so to establish that before or during or when things start to get more dangerous so that you have a safe place. One of the other things that's on here is the more resources is this SWAP USA, which is a sex worker led support group. There is not one in Kentucky, but they do have a lot of chapters and a lot of resources to use that are specific to sex work. And then we do have some human trafficking. There's some hotlines, but again, that's if forced or coerced. We don't really think that all of sex work, is human trafficking, but there do seem to be a lot of resources for folks once they are considered a victim of trafficking. No, so I think that's it, and we can go to the next one.
Great, thanks. And then we just pulled out some resources. Hartley has already mentioned some of them for sex workers in the US. So SWAP USA is a national sex work-led organization. As Hartley said, Kentucky doesn't have a chapter, but there are other chapters in cities and states around the country. The Sex Workers Project is a project out of New York City, but they serve sex workers across the US, offering free legal services and advocacy. So if someone is needing legal advice, that may be a good place to direct them. Obviously, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, you're not going to direct someone to unless they are expressing feelings of depression, suicidal ideation, etc. to you, but it is good to know that number. If someone is still using and feels isolated, Never Use Alone hotlines and other overdose prevention support lines are a great resource. In terms of uh, receiving adequate medical care, local Planned Parenthoods can be a great and safe place to receive STI testing, reproductive health. Planned Parenthoods serve people of all genders. So if someone is obviously I can't speak for every Planned Parenthood across the state or country and say that people won't experience any medical stigma from providers at Planned Parenthood, but it is probably less likely than at private practices or hospitals. So it may feel like a safer option for people to get their physical health needs met. Again, National Human Trafficking Hotline, if someone is feeling that they are being trafficked or coerced, that is a good number to have. SAMHSA, again, if someone is struggling. Oh,
Someone is asking in the chat how they could print these off. Is there a way to get the link?
I think Hartley and I talked about sending out PDFs of the slides after, so we are happy to make sure that people get PDFs of the slides if Brooke is willing to send them out to folks.
We also can add them to our webinar archive page, and I just put that link in the chat.
All right, I'll just go through the rest of these quickly. Next Distro offers free harm reduction supplies by mail. So, and I believe, so if someone is using and is in a rural or isolated community and they need harm reduction supplies, Next Distro is a great option. United Way, I know that there are United Ways all over Kentucky. They can help with food, housing, and other services. And then again, if someone has experienced assault and wants support around that, the National Sexual Assault Hotline, RAINN, is a great resource as well. We just want to make sure that people know that they're not alone and that that there are options for support. And that is our presentation. Please scan the QR code to take our survey. And if you have any questions, we've got 6 minutes. And thank you all for coming today and for bearing with me for an hour and a half.
Thank you so much, you all. Just a minute on the survey. We do ask you to kind of reflect on how you might have felt about this before. So it seems a little awkward. We're saying before you took this, what do you think? And then after you took this, what do you think? So be sure you're kind of reading those the headings for some of the questions so that you know if it's before or after. And then we do have some open-ended pieces where we are hoping to learn from you what we're missing in this space. And also some impacts on both gender and sexuality that we hope that you weigh in on who it's impacting in your communities and how to start to get more data on how many people are impacted by this, especially with substance use disorder. So thank you for informing our work and being generous with your time. We will be sending this Visa gift card in the mail. So whatever address you want to put in the form at the very end, that's where it'll go. And then reach out to us if you have questions about that. it will take, with the holidays, we're not quite sure how long it's going to take, but we are going to start sending them tomorrow. So hopefully it will not be too late, too long, but that's the end of it.
Harley,
But
are there any restrictions on who can take the survey? Do you have to be a peer support specialist or just anyone that has attended?
anyone attended.
Great.
And also, Brooke, if the QR code doesn't work for you, Brooke put the address. And if you do this address, you have to put in this little code in addition, so you can cut and paste that. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Casey and Dr. Feld. So we have a lot happening in the chat. We've got the QR code on the screen for their survey with the Visa gift card. But that link is also in the chat if the QR code's not working for you or if you can't take a picture right now. We also have the link for the continuing education certificate for peer support specialists in the chat. And when you complete the survey, you will be automatically emailed your certificate. And then we also have a link for the webinar archives page where you can see past episodes. I like calling them episodes, and slides. And that's where we'll post the slides from this presentation. Just checking the chat, make sure there's no more questions. Awesome. Casey, you did a great job. I was actually disappointed there wasn't more cat. I was expecting just way more cat content, but you know, that's okay. I'll cope. Okay, I'll just leave the chat open one more time. It looks like we still have a lot of people on the webinar, so grab those links out of the chat before we close. Any closing? Oh, thank you, Casey. Oh my
Yeah,
gosh.
he was on my lap most of the webinar, but I think the blur background especially makes it hard. He does not like to be held, as you can see. Loves a lap, hates to be held.
Oh my goodness, that's so precious. Well, any closing thoughts from our presenters?
Nothing for me. Thank you all so much. This is my favorite stuff to talk about. So I'm really happy to have had the opportunity to do so.
Awesome. Such an important topic. And okay. Thank you all so much. I'm so glad that we didn't get iced out of power and Wi-Fi. Everything worked. What a relief. Everyone, please stay safe and safer out there. Thanks for being here at the webinar today.
Thank you. Appreciate the voice.